කැමරේට ආරාධනා කරනවා.
I'm going to speak in English, and I'll try to remember to speak slow so that the translators can follow. First of all, thank you very much, HEO, for inviting me to speak. And I'd like to, before talking a bit about the report, I want to pull back a bit and look at this issue in relation to some of the other land issues that are taking place at the moment. So in the first week of October, the Land Commissioner General's Department announced that they will be continuing the Urumaya land program. Right? I'm not sure how far they have proceeded, but the reason I want to flag this is when the Urumaya program itself was announced, there are some groups who celebrated it, even among civil society groups, because they felt it's very important for people to have greater private land ownership in the country, that it would give a greater financial security. And then there were other groups, I'm caricaturing here, there are other groups including PAR, who raised problems with it, including the potential for the Urumaya program to actually contribute to landlessness, indebtedness, and a potential rural crisis. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons necessarily, but one of the problems with the Urumaya program being implemented, particularly in the north and the east, is because of these kinds of continuing problems, which are also inextricably tied with the war and its aftermath. Because due to the war, in the north and east, as many of you all would know, who have experienced it firsthand, that the normal governance of land administration did not happen as it was supposed to. So for instance, in the rest of the country, you had a series of land alienation, where landless people were given land documentation. Instead, what we saw in the north and the east is a general suspension. Now, going into the land Urumaya, what it means is that we're going to see very few people in the north and east, in comparison to the rest of the country, being able to claim lands. 2 weeks ago, I was in Tungari, in Mullitivu. They had received 690, I think, applications, and they could only process 42 because of this issue, continuing problem with land documentation, the inability to survey land, the lack of enough land officials to do this task, that there is basically a huge problem in terms of land documentation, the demarcation of land. And when you look at the work, including groups like HEO that they have done in Ampara, along with the Ampara District Alliance for Land Reform, they have documented a whole series of land problems, ranging from military occupation, the Forest Department, Mahamali Authority, wildlife, archaeological, and so it is still unresolved, these land problems. And so there is a larger problem that we really have to confront about how is the state going to address these land problems, because it really hasn't fundamentally resolved these, even while it talks about the need to address the root causes of the war, about how you need to deal with ethnic tensions, these are the fundamental problems that have to be resolved. And unless the state takes it seriously, it's not going to really move forward. So instead what we're going to have is people affected in districts like Ampara because they cannot resolve it. And there is no shortcut to it. It's not about having one circular that can address all these series of problems. That while you need a large process which deals with things like loss of documentation, competing claims, you also need case-specific responses, including like here, like on this case of the sugar cultivation. Talking a bit about the report, I'd really like to commend the authors and everyone who was involved. I've done a bit of land work myself, and I have to confess that I tend to get bored reading land reports. But this one was really fascinating. You just pick and look through even the compilation in terms of the annex, the fact that they have put together all the kinds of land ownership documents that the farmers have been given or not given, as the case might be. And I think it really adds not just to the process of documenting these land problems, but also in terms of setting the framework for how we look at it. As some of the previous speakers mentioned, the whole issue of ethnicization. Right? Just to give you an anecdote, you walk into the land ministry, and when you enter, it's a square room, and you see a whole set of previous land ministers. One of the striking things, apart from that they're all male, is that they are almost all Sinhalese. And I think this is a fundamental question of when we talk about the issue of land, and people talk about the inability to devolve land power to the north and the east, is that this is a fundamentally ethnicized problem. There's no way of escaping it. And so if you have particular authorities which are close to 90% Sinhala, the decisions that they make will inevitably be ethnicized, unfortunately. So there's no shortcut about dealing with this ethnicization, particularly when the state authorities that are meant to provide the solutions themselves are so deeply ethnicized. And so that's where this conundrum about equality approaching issues in terms of an equality approach as a fundamental flaw in just suggesting that somehow you just set up structures and processes and they'll resolve themselves. And that's why issues about how we look at land and power, and that's something that this report really documents well. So not just does it trace the history of Ampara and its own land and ethnicized problems, but it also looks and traces the development of this sugar company. And as the authors mentioned, this has been also at great risk to the research staff, and that they couldn't do some of the research that they wanted to do because of the threats to the researchers. So in that sense, I think we really need to commend the researchers who did this report. There are also other lots of fascinating aspects to this. One of the things that I just want to pick up on is how from, I think it's 2009 to 15, that despite the amount of sugar harvesting, the four biggest companies produced roughly 50,000 metric tons. Sri Lanka produced no sugar. And that's kind of an incredible stat, right? The fact is that the majority of it went straight into ethanol. And this highlights this larger issue of whenever we talk and everything is justified in terms of development, national purpose, national security, all of these rather large terms, is that when you fundamentally try and track your way through it, what does this mean? Does it mean that Sri Lanka's sugar needs have been met? Does it mean that Sri Lanka's, the amount of foreign currency we need to buy and import sugar is reduced? Yet we will justify why there have to be tax breaks, why we need these public-private partnerships to grow sugar, but we don't actually produce sugar. And I think that's why fundamentally we also need to question and challenge the kind of underlying logic and justification for these kinds of projects, and why this land continues to have to stay with these kind of companies. And I think this report really makes a strong argument for us to also force to challenge the state on these kinds of logic. And I just want to end on that, and I think really well done. And I really applaud your work and the work also of HEO in really advocating on behalf of so many different communities who've been affected by a really broad range of land problems, and that we, as broader civil society, media, really need to ensure we highlight.